He was 23 and nearly out of road. No family, no wages waiting, no plan for the winter, just a folding pocket knife his grandfather had left him, and $3 folded twice in the pocket of a work shirt. And with those $3, Robert Brooks bought a sealed boxcar standing off a weathered spur in the yard at Pine Creek, a hulk of iron and plank that 3 grown men had failed to pry open before him. But what nobody in that yard knew, and what Robert himself would not know for another 2 days, was that behind that stubborn iron door sat freight that had not been touched in 40 years. Settle in with me and stay close, and let us know where you're watching from, because this story is worth the long telling. Robert Brooks had been born on a scrap of leased grazing land 2 ridges east of Pine Creek, the only child of a woman who died of fever when he was 6, and a father who quietly drank himself out of the tenancy by the time Robert was 11. What followed was not cruelty exactly, only the plain machinery of a small mountain town sorting a boy without people into whatever hands would take him, and the hands that took him belonged to his father's older brother, a lean, unsmiling stockman named Harlan Brooks, who ran 200 head on a lease up the North Fork and did not believe in coddling anyone, least of all a nephew he had not asked for. Robert slept in the tack room off the barn from the age of 11 until the age of 23, and in those 12 years he learned to shoe a horse, to butcher a beef, to mend wire in a snowstorm without feeling his fingers, and to keep his mouth closed when a man twice his size was in a mood. He grew tall and rope-shouldered and quiet, with hands that had been split and stitched so many times the scars made a faint white map across the knuckles, and eyes that took in more than his mouth ever gave back. The one exception in those years, the one person who looked at Robert and saw a boy worth teaching rather than a chore worth assigning, was an old widower named Otis Pennell, who ran the small blacksmith and repair shop at the crossroads 2 miles below Harlan's lease. Otis was 60-something and half-deaf from a lifetime of hammer strikes, a widower twice over with no living children, and he had watched Robert ride past his forge on errands since the boy was 12. One winter afternoon when Robert had been sent down to fetch a repaired singletree, Otis had put a piece of cold iron in his hand and asked him, without ceremony, whether he would like to know how a thing was mended, rather than only how it was used. Robert had said yes. And for the next 9 years, every hour Harlan did not claim, Robert spent at Otis Pennell's forge, learning to read the color of hot iron, to draw out a bar, to set a rivet, to true a wagon rim, to salvage sound wood from a split beam, to unstick a rusted lock without breaking its wards, and, most quietly and most importantly, to see the worth in a thing other people had already thrown out. Otis rarely praised him aloud, but he left him tools to use unattended, which in that man's language was the same as praise. Otis had also given him, on the boy's 16th birthday, a folding pocket knife with a bone handle worn smooth as river stone and a maker's stamp from a Sheffield firm long out of business. It had belonged to Otis's own father, a shipwright from the old country, and Otis had said only, handing it across the anvil, that a man who worked with his hands ought to own one good blade that would outlast him. Robert had carried that knife in his right trouser pocket every day of the 7 years since, sharpened it on Sunday mornings, and thought of Otis every time his thumb found the smooth spot on the bone. When Otis died in his sleep in the spring of Robert's 22nd year, the shop was sold to pay a distant nephew. The forge went cold, and Robert lost the only steady kindness of his life in the space of one hushed funeral behind the Crossroads Chapel. The year that followed was the hardest of the 12. Harlan's temper, always dry tinder, took a flame after the drought thinned the herd, and by the following spring the lease itself was in trouble. The bank had come twice, and Harlan had made a decision he did not bother to soften. There were mouths he could feed and mouths he could not, he told Robert one evening on the porch, and Robert, being grown now and unmarried and childless, was a mouth that could feed itself elsewhere. He was given the weekend to gather his belongings, a canvas bedroll, 1 change of shirts, the pocket knife, and $3 in small coin that Harlan counted onto the rail as if paying off a debt he resented. There was no shouting. There was no goodbye supper. On Monday morning at first light, Robert saddled the borrowed sorrel he had been told he might keep as far as Pine Creek and no further, tightened the girth with steady hands, and rode down out of the North Fork without looking back at the tack room that had been his home for 12 winters. He carried, that morning, everything the world had left him: the knife in his right pocket, the $3 in his left, the bedroll tied behind the cantle, a tin cup, a hatchet, a whetstone, a small pouch of jerky, and the plain habits of a man who had been taught early that no one was coming to help. He carried also, though he could not have named it as such, a way of looking at broken and abandoned things that he had learned across 9 years of Otis Pennell's forge. The patient, appraising look of a man who believed most things thrown away had been thrown away too soon. It was that look, more than the $3, more than the knife, more than any letter of introduction he did not possess, that would matter most in the days ahead, but he did not know that yet. He knew only that Pine Creek lay 11 miles down the wagon road, that the sorrel was tired, that the wind out of the pass had turned cold for October, and that whatever life he was riding toward would have to be built out of whatever he could find when he got there. The wagon road out of the North Fork ran along a shoulder of gray shale for the first 2 miles and then bent south along the creek where the willows had already lost their leaves. Robert rode at a walk because the sorrel would not go faster, and because there was nowhere in the world he needed to be by a particular hour. The sky was the flat, cold color of pewter, and the wind came down the pass in long, even breaths that smelled of snow that had not yet fallen. He pulled the collar of his canvas coat up around his ears and rode with his hands wrapped in the reins for warmth, and he did not think, in any orderly way, about Harlan Brooks, or the tack room, or the 12 winters behind him. He thought instead about the sorrel's off hind foot, which was landing a little short, and about the fact that he had not eaten since the day before, and about the distance to Pine Creek in a horse's slow, steady miles. At the second creek crossing, he dismounted and let the sorrel drink, and lifted the off hind hoof onto his knee and looked at it. A pebble had wedged itself under the shoe against the frog, and he took the pocket knife out of his right trouser pocket and opened the smaller blade and worked the stone loose in the careful way Otis had taught him, prying against the shoe and not against the hoof. He folded the blade shut and put the knife back in his pocket and set the foot down and stroked the horse's neck once. It was the first small kindness of the day, and it was to a horse that did not belong to him and would not follow him past the town. He rode on. The road climbed a low ridge and then dropped through a stand of yellow pine where the light came down in long slanted bars and the needles hushed the sound of the hooves. A wagon passed him, going the other way, a man and a woman with 2 children and a load of split firewood, and the man lifted a hand, and Robert lifted his in return, and neither of them spoke. That was the only person he saw for 6 miles. By mid-morning the wind had turned sharper, and thin cloud had begun to run in from the northwest, and Robert loosened the bedroll enough to pull out a strip of jerky and chewed it slowly as he rode. The jerky was old and hard and tasted of salt and smoke, and he thought of Otis's forge, of the smell of scorched hoof and quenching water, of the way the old man had chewed jerky exactly like this while examining a bent wagon rim, turning it over in his blackened hands and murmuring to himself about where the metal had given up. Robert swallowed and pushed the thought down carefully, the way a man banks a fire he wants to keep but not feed. Around noon, the road came out of the pines into open grass country, and he could see Pine Creek from a rise 2 miles off, a scatter of low buildings along a single street, a water tower painted red, a whitewashed church with a bell that was not ringing, and beyond the town the pale straight line of the rail spur running out into the sage. Smoke stood up thin from a dozen chimneys. From that distance the town looked no larger than a handful of matchboxes laid out on a table, and Robert sat a while on the rise and looked at it and let the sorrel breathe. He had never been closer to the place than this ridge, though he had seen it in the distance most Sundays of his life. He rode down into it at a walk. The wagon road became a wider dirt street with plank sidewalks on either side, and the smell of the town reached him before the buildings did. Coal smoke, horse manure, the sourish yeast of a bakery, the raw pine of a lumberyard cutting fresh boards. Men in braces and waistcoats stood outside a feed store watching him ride in and did not call out. A woman with a basket crossed in front of him and nodded and went on. He rode past a saloon called the Antler and a hardware store with a plow chained to a post out front, and came at last to the livery at the far end of the street, where he swung down stiff-legged and led the sorrel inside and paid the hostler 10 cents to water and grain the horse for the afternoon. That was one of his $3 gone before he had eaten a meal, but he had promised Harlan the animal would come back sound, and a promise made to a man who had counted coins onto a porch rail was still a promise. He asked the hostler where a man could sleep cheap, and the hostler looked him over once and jerked a thumb toward the rail yard and said the section boss sometimes let honest hands bunk in the loft above the tool shed for the price of splitting kindling. Robert thanked him and walked out into the wind and turned his face toward the yard, and it was on that short walk between the livery and the spur that he first saw, standing dark and shut and forgotten on a length of weed-grown track, the sealed boxcar. The boxcar stood by itself on a length of siding that the main yard had grown around and then forgotten, the way a creek leaves an old channel behind when it takes a new course. Robert stopped in the wind and looked at it. It was a wooden car of the older pattern, 34 feet long by his eye, sheathed in vertical plank that had once been painted a dark oxide red and was now weathered to the color of dried blood and bare wood in equal patches. The roof was tin, curled up at one corner where a nail had let go and a squirrel or a jay had worked at the seam. The trucks under it were rust-locked to the rails, and the couplers front and back had gone the same brown as the rails themselves. Grass grew up through the ties beneath it. On the side that faced him, the great sliding door was closed and had been closed a long time, held by an iron hasp and a padlock that was no longer a padlock but a solid lump of oxidation the shape of one. Above the door, in ghost lettering pale as chalk, he could still read a fragment of a railroad name and a car number, though half the letters had scaled away with the paint. He walked once around it. The far side was the same, except that a second, smaller lock had been driven through a staple, and the whole assembly then wrapped in a length of baling wire that had itself rusted into the wood. Someone had wanted this car shut and had wanted the shutting to hold. The plank walls, when he laid his hand on them, were sound under his palm. He knocked with a knuckle at 3 places along the side, and the sound came back dull and full, not the hollow ring of an empty box. Whatever was inside was still inside. He found the section boss in the tool shed, a stout man of 50 in a wool vest and a railroad cap, going over a tally sheet by the light of a single window. Robert took off his hat. He said he was looking for work of any kind, and he asked about the boxcar on the dead siding. The section boss looked up at him over a pair of wire spectacles and gave a short laugh without much humor in it. That car, he said, had sat there since before he took the yard, which was better than 15 years, and it had been sitting when the previous boss took over from the one before him. Freight refused, or freight forgotten, or freight consigned to a man who never came for it. Nobody now living in Pine Creek knew which. The railroad had written it off the books long ago. 3 men from the section gang had tried to force the door one Sunday for a jug of whiskey between them, and had given up with skinned knuckles and a broken pry bar. He would sell it, the section boss said, for what it stood on the ground as $3 cash, and Robert could have the timber and the tin and the iron scrap and whatever was in it, if he could get in it, and if he could not get in it, that was his misfortune and not the railroad's. Robert took the $2 from his left pocket and added to them the 90 cents in coin that remained after the livery, and he laid the money on the tally sheet in a neat stack and stood while the section boss counted it and wrote out a bill of sale in pencil on the back of a printed form. The section boss signed it with a stub of a pencil wet at the tip of his tongue and handed it across and said plainly and without ceremony that the boxcar was Robert's now, and God help him. Robert folded the paper twice and put it into the pocket the money had come out of, and it was the only paper he owned in the world. He slept that first night in the loft above the tool shed, up a ladder with rungs worn smooth, in the smell of creosote and coal oil, with his bedroll opened on a heap of clean sacking and his boots beside him and the pocket knife under the folded coat that served as a pillow. He split kindling by lantern before he slept, and split more of it at first light. And in that way, he paid his rent and ate a bowl of oats and molasses the section boss's wife sent out to the shed in a tin bowl covered with a cloth. Then he went to the car. He worked at it 2 full days. He tried the padlock first with penetrating oil begged from the yard's grease can, and when the oil had soaked overnight, he took a length of iron bar and a small ball-peen hammer and worked the shackle patiently, the way Otis had shown him with rusted things, not beating, but persuading, tapping the body of the lock to break the rust bond within the wards, then applying steady pressure, then tapping again. On the afternoon of the second day, the shackle gave with a small dry crack that sounded like a stick breaking under snow. He cut the baling wire on the far side with the small blade of his knife, 1 strand at a time, and then he set his shoulder against the door and heaved. It did not move. He heaved again, and the door shifted 1/4 of an inch in its track and stopped, seized by 40 years of grit in the roller channel. He climbed under the car and up onto the coupler and studied the track from above with the lantern in his hand, and he saw that the top of the channel was packed hard with a black paste of coal dust and old grease and the corpses of insects. He scraped it out with the point of the knife along the whole length of the door, working slowly, with his hat off and sweat running into his eyes, though the day was cold, and then he oiled the channel from a can of axle grease the section boss let him have for nothing. When he set his shoulder to the door again, it moved a hand's breadth, and then a foot, and then, complaining in a long, low iron voice that seemed to come from the belly of the car itself, it slid back on its track and let the daylight in. The inside of the car smelled of dry cedar and old canvas, and the faint mineral cool of things that have been closed away from weather. Dust hung in the shaft of light he had let in and turned slowly in it. Robert stood on the ground and looked in before he climbed up, and what he saw made him take his hat off a second time without knowing why he did it. The car was full. Not full in the way freight is full when it has been loaded and shifted in transit. Full in the way a room is full when someone has arranged it and then walked out and shut the door. Along the left wall, lashed with hemp rope to iron rings set into the studs, stood 12 wooden crates, stenciled in black paint with the name of a hardware firm out of St. Louis and a date, 1883. Beside the crates were 4 wooden barrels bunged and sealed with wax, and beside the barrels a stack of rolled canvas that proved, when he later opened it, to be 6 new wagon covers folded and tied. Along the right wall were bolts of dark wool cloth wrapped in oiled paper, a crate of glass lamp chimneys nested in straw, 2 cast-iron cook stoves crated on their sides with their doors wired shut, a small anvil bedded in a wooden cradle, and a chest of carpenter's tools, planes and chisels and augers, laid in their fitted trays and gone only lightly to rust. Robert climbed up into the car and stood among these things in the shaft of dusty light. He walked the length of it slowly, touching each thing once with the flat of his hand, as if to be certain it was real. 40 years, he thought, though he did not yet know it was 40, and the number, when he later learned it from the date stenciled on the crates and the date of the bill of lading, would only confirm what he already felt standing there, that the car had been closed on 1 century of the country and opened in another, and that everything in it had been waiting for someone who had never come. At the far end of the car, wedged behind the last crate as if placed there deliberately by a hand that meant it to be found only by someone who had bothered to look, was a small tin box the size of a family Bible, painted black, with a hinged lid and a simple hook catch. Robert knelt and lifted it out and set it on the plank floor in the light and opened it. Inside, folded on top, was a sheet of heavy paper covered on both sides in a careful, slanted hand in brown ink. Beneath the paper was a canvas pouch, drawn shut with a leather thong, and when Robert loosened the thong and let the mouth of the pouch open, gold coins slid over one another with the soft, heavy sound that only gold makes. Double eagles, 20 of them, and beneath the double eagles a layer of smaller coins, half eagles and quarter eagles, and at the bottom a thin bundle of banknotes tied with string. Beside the pouch in the tin lay a folding pocket knife with a bone handle worn smooth and a maker's stamp he knew before he turned it to the light. The same Sheffield firm, the same pattern, the twin in every respect, but ware of the knife in his own right pocket. He sat down on the plank floor with the tin between his knees and did not move for a long time. Then he took up the sheet of paper and unfolded it in the shaft of light, and read. Robert read the letter through once without moving, and then he read it again more slowly, and then he folded it along its old creases and put it back into the tin box on top of the canvas pouch and closed the lid. He climbed down out of the car into the yard, where the afternoon light lay low across the ties, and he stood a long minute with one hand on the plank wall of the car and the other in his right trouser pocket around the bone handle of Otis's knife. Then he went and split kindling for the tool shed until it grew too dark to see the axe. The next morning, Robert began work in an orderly way, because Otis had taught him that a man overwhelmed does one thing well and then the next. He carried the tin box up to the loft, wrapped it in his second shirt, and laid it beneath the sacking where he slept. He kept the twin knife in the box with the letter, and he kept his own knife in his pocket where it had always been. Then he walked down the plank street to the bank at the corner of the feed store and the church, and he asked for the manager. The manager was a narrow man of 40 named Elwood Pace, who wore sleeve garters and had ink on his thumb, and who listened to Robert without expression, and then looked at the bill of sale folded twice, and then at Robert's face, and then at the bill of sale again. Robert asked whether coin of the old date was still good. Elwood Pace said gold was gold. Robert deposited 5 of the double eagles for safekeeping and kept the rest of the box in the loft, and he opened an account in the name of Robert Brooks with a balance of $100. He went then to the section boss and asked to buy the length of siding where the boxcar stood, a strip of ground 12 feet wide and 40 feet long, weed-grown and useless to the railroad. The section boss, whose name was Merritt Hollis, considered it, wrote to the division office in Robert's hearing, and by the end of the week had a reply granting sale of the parcel for $8. Robert paid it in coin and folded the second bill of sale in with the first. He set to work on the car itself. He pulled the tin corner of the roof flat and nailed it down with new roofing nails bought at the hardware store for 11 cents. He replaced 2 plank boards on the north side, using cedar cut and planed at the lumber yard by a man named Judd Ackerman, 52, a widower millwright with a limp from a saw accident, who charged Robert nothing for the planing after Robert helped him true a warped belt on his shafting. He greased the door channel a second time and hung a new hasp of his own forging, done in the smithy at the far end of the yard, where the farrier, a black man of 60 named Ephraim Sowell, who had shoed horses in Pine Creek for 30 years, let Robert use the forge in return for striking work on Saturdays. Robert drew out iron the way Otis had taught him, and set the rivets cold, and hung the new hasp with a lock bought for 40 cents. Inside the car he made an inventory in pencil on the back of a feed store handbill. 12 crates of hardware, 4 barrels of what proved on opening to be lamp oil still sound in 3 of them, 6 wagon covers, 20 bolts of wool, a crate of lamp chimneys with only 2 broken 2 cook stoves, an anvil, and a chest of carpenter's tools. He carried the anvil down first, because it was the heaviest, and because he wanted it under his own hand. He carried it on a plank sled to Ephraim's smithy, and Ephraim looked at it and said it was a good English anvil and worth more than Robert had paid for the car and the ground and the lock together. Word of the boxcar spread the way news spreads in a rail town, quietly and completely, and by the middle of the second week people came by the siding to look, not to take, only to see. A woman named Mabel Ord, 47, who kept the boarding house on the corner, brought Robert a supper of bean soup and cornbread in a covered pail on the evening he lifted the second cook stove down. She said her husband had died on the line 11 years back, and she knew the look of a young man working past his supper. Robert thanked her and ate the soup sitting on the coupler with the pail on his knee, and afterward he washed the pail and returned it clean with 2 lamp chimneys inside, and that was the beginning of it. A rancher named Tobias Kerr, 59, drove in from the flats north of town and bought 4 bolts of wool for winter coats for his hands, paid in silver, and hauled the bolts away in a wagon. A carpenter named Whit Dorr, 34, bought the chest of tools for $22 after examining every plane and chisel in the fitted trays, and he came back the next day with a cured ham as a matter of fairness, saying the tools were worth more than what he had paid. Robert took the ham and hung it in the loft. The storekeeper at the hardware, a man named Prosper Lionhard, 62, bought 8 of the 12 crates of hardware for cash on inventory and had them wheeled to his cellar on a handcart, and he told Robert plainly that the stock was old but honest and would sell out of his store within the year. The lamp chimneys went 1 and 2 at a time to housewives who came shy to the siding door. The wagon covers went to a freighting outfit out of Bellwood for $9 apiece. By the first snowfall in early November, the car was empty of freight, and Robert had $187 deposited with Elwood Pace, plus the gold still in the tin box, plus the anvil at Ephraim's, plus the boxcar itself standing on his own strip of ground. He had not spent a nickel he did not need to spend. He had eaten most nights on Mabel Ord's porch for 15 cents a plate, and he had slept in the loft until the second week when Merritt Hollis said the loft was his so long as he wanted it, no kindling required. Robert began then to make the boxcar into a place to live. He cut a window into the south wall using a keyhole saw borrowed from Whit Door, and framed it with cedar and glazed it with a sash bought second-hand from a house being torn down on the far edge of town. He built a bunk along the west wall from planks left over after the roof repair, and he laid a floor of tongue and groove pine over the plank he found, and he set one of the 2 cook stoves in the northeast corner on a bed of brick, cut a stovepipe through the roof, and flashed the joint with tin bent cold over his knee. He hung a shelf above the bunk for his tin cup, his hatchet, his whetstone, the tin box, and Otis's knife when he laid it down at night. He built a small workbench along the east wall opposite the bunk with a vise bolted through the plank, and he began to take in mending, a broken lamp bracket from Mabel Ord, a warped door hinge from the church, a chain that wanted a link welded from Tobias Kerr. By Christmas week, people in Pine Creek spoke of Robert Brooks as the young man who kept the old car by the spur, and they knew where to find him, and they knew what he could mend. Ephraim Sowell had begun to let him take smithing jobs on his own account when the work was small, in exchange for a share of coal, and Robert paid the share honestly to the pound. Judd Ackerman brought him a set of draw knives that had belonged to his father and would not be used by any child of his, and he laid them on the workbench and said only, "Use them." Whit Doer brought Robert into the room at the back of the hardware store on the first Sunday of the month, where 4 men played dominoes and drank coffee, and he introduced Robert by name, and the men nodded and dealt him in, and after that Robert went every first Sunday and lost more than he won and did not mind. He wrote a letter to Harlan Brooks in January, telling him the sorrel had reached Pine Creek Sound, that the hostler had cared for it a week, and that a freighter bound for the North Fork had carried it back to the lease as promised. He enclosed no money and made no reference to the tack room or the porch rail. He signed it Robert Brooks, Pine Creek. He did not receive a reply and did not expect one. The boxcar acquired small rituals through the winter. On Saturday evenings, Mabel Ord brought a covered pail and sat on the coupler while Robert ate, and she talked about her husband and about the boarding house and about the price of flour, and Robert listened and said little and washed the pail. On Sunday mornings, Robert sharpened Otis's knife on the whetstone at the workbench, holding the bone handle the way Otis had held it, and he sharpened the twin knife from the tin box in the same order, and he laid both knives on the shelf side by side when he was done. On Monday mornings he opened the door of the car wide to air it, and the smell of cedar and dust that had lived inside it for 40 years gave way, month by month, to the smell of coal smoke and lamp oil and pine shavings, which was the smell of a place lived in. On a clear evening late in February, Robert sat on the coupler of his own car, with the door slid halfway open behind him and the last of the sun on the red-painted water tower across the yard. He had finished a bracket for the church that afternoon, and the hinge of Mabel Ord's back gate that morning, and he had money folded twice in his left pocket the way he had once folded $3 there. The cook stove inside was banked low, and the tin box sat on the shelf above the bunk with the letter still folded along its old creases inside it. He had read the letter 4 more times through the winter, and could have said the words without opening the paper because the man who had written it had been a freight agent named Amos Ridley, who had lived in Pine Creek for 22 years and had lost a son at 7 to the same fever that had taken Robert's mother. And Amos Ridley had loaded that car himself and had died before the consignee came, and had written in careful slanted brown ink that whoever opened this car had already worked harder for it than any owner, and that the money and the knife were for him, and that he hoped the finder would stay in Pine Creek if Pine Creek would have him, because a town was only a town when a young man could begin in it. Robert took Otis's knife from his right pocket and opened the smaller blade and closed it again. He thought of Otis at the forge, and of Harlan on the porch counting coins onto a rail, and he thought of the 3 men who had failed at the door with skinned knuckles, and of Amos Ridley, whom he had never met, sealing a car in 1883 with a tin box tucked behind the last crate. 2 men he had never seen as old men had loved him without knowing him, one who had raised him at a forge and given him a knife, and one who had died 40 years before he was born, and had left him a twin of that knife and enough gold to begin. He set Otis's knife on the shelf beside the twin knife and looked at them a long time in the lamplight, 2 bone handles worn smooth by 2 different hands, and he understood that this was what a man inherited when no family would keep him, the tools other solitary men had used and passed on. He slid the door shut against the cold and turned the new hasp with the 40-cent lock. Snow had begun again in the pass, and the wind smelled the way it had smelled the morning he had ridden out of the North Fork, and he was not cold. Robert Brooks was 23 and homeless. He had $3 to his name, and he spent it on a sealed boxcar 3 men could not crack on a weed-grown spur in Pine Creek. It was the best $3 he ever spent. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and who in your life once saw value in you when no one else did. And ask yourself, before you close the light, what have you walked past this week, sealed and forgotten and cheap, that might be waiting only for the patient hands willing to open it?